Inspiration information for this talk today really comes from, as Gail mentioned, a case that we had with the ACCC last year. To date, from 1999, there's been about 25 applications to the ACCC to receive immunity, if you like, from anti-competitive behaviour with their joint collaborative procurement projects. The one from last year, the South Australian Group of Councils, was the first time that an application to the ACCC has been rejected out of 26 cases. So the information really comes from that 12-month process. There was something like 31 submissions made to the ACCC compared with 2 or 3 maximum for all the other submissions. So there was a hell of a lot of interest in this case. So collaborative procurement, what is it? It's agreement between a group of councils to procure services or products that they might need, that's needed by all of the councils. And the ACCC requirement, the Australian Competition Consumer Commission requirement, is that if they receive an application, then the ACCC assess to see whether they are going to give them immunity against any potential anti-competitive behaviour. What do the ACCC do when they get the application? Well, what they seek to do is apply a future with and without test. So they look at the future with the potential application, the application and the future without, and they use a net public benefit test to do that. They look at the different components of the application, and they look at the benefits and the detriments of each of those and try and ascertain whether there's a net public benefit or detriment. And the onus is on the applying party to provide the proof as to whether there is net public benefit or detriment. Funnily enough, the veracity of that proof, the correctness of it, is really only tested if there is objections to the application. Now, when these applications go in, the applications in the past have generally centred around the net public benefit being either transaction cost savings, economies of scale, or trying to achieve a level of tonnage or services to be able to bring in some new infrastructure. So they're the 3 things that we'll look at. The first one analogy that we've come up with as a result of last year's work is it's like a shopping trip with others, and the others might be friends, they might be neighbours, they might be otherwise. You might not know them, you might not get along with them all the time, but you have to do this shopping trip with others. And you have to look at who should come shopping, when are we going, what are we going to buy, how are we going to get there, when are we going to go shopping? Is everyone right to go shopping right now? How long will the shopping take? Will we try and buy the same thing and get a volume discount, or are we going to try and buy our own specific thing? What happens if we need to split up? What happens if we run out of time? And how important is it that we get exactly what we need? So look at the first driver, transaction cost savings. The fees and costs that are normally put in these applications to the ACCC involve lower legal fees, consulting fees, and also less internal council staff time applied to the tender process, the procurement process. The findings from last year's case saw that the councils must still do most of the things that they have to do when they are tendering by themselves. So they still need to agree to go to tender, they still need to develop tender documents, they still need to assess whether they're suitable for their own council, they still need to receive submissions and assess the submissions internally, and they still need to provide reports for the council for ratification. In addition, with the collaborative procurement process, the councils need to involve themselves with all the other councils involved in the process. So they need to agree on the tender process, they need to agree when it's going to start, they need to agree on the contents of the tender specification, they need to agree on actions that will happen as they hit hurdles along the way, and they need to work with each other to negotiate with preferred tenders and the final outcome for the contract documents. There's quite a bit of extra work to do when the collaborative procurement process is selected. The findings from last year's case identified for transaction costs that pricing options, so if you have more pricing options in your tender, then you're going to have higher transaction costs. If you have alternate tenders submitted by by contractors, then you're going to have higher transaction costs. The number of councils, obviously if there's more councils, then you're going to have higher transaction costs. And an interesting one is many of the collaborative procurements allow the councils to opt in and opt out. And if a council is able to opt out, then that increases the number of the amount of the transaction costs. And this is an example from the South Australian case last year. So there were 5 councils involved, and an average South Australian council has about 20 tender price components, different size bins, different types of services. The 5 councils are allowed to opt in and out. That creates 31 different combinations, permutations of councils that contractors have to submit prices for. So a standard conforming bid would involve 620 tender prices. Now, this proposal involved a bit of a vague specification, was the proposal. And so with a vague specification comes alternate tenders from contractors. In this case, I've put down 3 examples. So if you have an alternate term, disposal location and different bin arrangements, all of a sudden you can see quickly you get to almost 5,000 prices that the councils have to consider between themselves and decide on which ones they're actually going to go with. And the other unusual thing is that the alternate tenders might not be the same from the different contractors. So you could get more than this. A couple of quick examples. A Victorian tender involving 5 councils, which actually this one actually didn't go through the ACCC, so it's a bit of an unusual thing there. But this one had 353 pages of tender pricing, an estimated 16,000 prices. Another South Australian tender involving 7 councils required 21,000 prices to be submitted. And what ended up happening here was that a lot of the tender pricing was ignored by contractors, and what happens is the tender becomes so complex to assess for the officers that they end up just going with the incumbent. The second driver, economies of scale. The economies of scale is really, it's quite a comprehensive argument put forward in applications for the reason for collaborative procurement. So the question here is, does more volume, more services, more tonnage actually generate a lower price per unit? And you see my backhand here definitely shows that there is a sweet spot with economies of scale. So looking at the long run average cost, the research, this was very comprehensively investigated by quite a few parties last year, but what we found that you can see at the start of the curved graph that as you get to the stage for a collection contract where a truck is fully utilised, then the average cost starts to come down. Past that point, it keeps decreasing until we found a point, give or take a few thousand, about 15,000 households, where it starts to plateau. And we call this the sweet spot. So from that point on to about 60,000, 70,000, 80,000 households, you get a point where the actual cost per service doesn't change that much. And beyond the 60,000, or give or take, with the waste management collection, what you experience is that the driving team starts to become too large to manage simply. So that's where you see the long run average cost increasing. And this is the same in a lot of industries. So the assumption that the more tonnes you get, the more services you get, isn't always true continually. Just on purchasing power, what we saw with larger contracts, higher bank guarantees, higher capital requirements and risk, and this becomes the domain of fewer tenderers. So if a council is looking to get a wide range of submissions for choice, the larger contracts involved with collaborative procurement worked against that, and they saw fewer tenderers. In South Australia, a sweet spot council was getting about 4, 5, 6 tenderers, whereas one that went past that 60,000 households looked to be getting 2 or 3 tenderers. So you definitely you start to become starved of choice. With the ACCC case last year, the geographic considerations were a big talking point. So you can see here, this is a North Queensland tender, obviously, and it was for collection. And this is common in the applications to date. And what they're looking for is a high percentage of boundaries in common. As the average boundaries in common was about 20% for the 25 applications to date. And you see here another example. This was for recyclables processing in Western Australia. Again, high boundaries in common. So that seems to be a model that was common. With the South Australian, pardon the graphics, but with the South Australian submission last year, you can see here in yellow the councils that were involved, and one council down south is actually totally separated from the other councils. And the boundaries in common were less than half for what the average was for all the other applications to the ACCC. And it starts to work against the key cost driver of having disposal and processing facilities and depots close by the collection areas. So if a council does proceed to collaborative procurement, they need to look at who's going to facilitate it, consultants, regional waste groups, council officers investing more time, or regional subsidiary was the case in South Australia. And one other thing that was investigated a lot last year was some qualitative factors. Waste diversion obviously is a big thing on everyone's plate at the moment, but we looked at, with waste diversion, is it more successful if there is a bigger contract? And we found that, we looked at all the states around Australia, we found that the bigger contracts, once they go beyond that sweet spot, they find it much harder than the sweet spot contracts to incorporate new innovation. And so objectives such as waste diversion were very difficult to achieve because you didn't have this propensity for change. The quality of service to the residents at the household, again, the good example was the bin system. So looking at all the different systems around Australia and the cost of the quality of service and the size of the contracts, the bin systems were slow to be changed in the bigger contracts. So for example, a bigger contract might only have a garbage recycling bin, where the sweet spot contracts introduced organics bins much more quickly. So the quality of service received at the household was generally higher in the sweet spot contracts than compared with the bigger contracts. Community education is often put in the applications to the ACCC. There's advantages to be gained through bulk media buying, through printing or sharing of staff, and that just needs to be weighed up with the ability to design educational messages that align with an individual council's waste objectives. And then contract flexibility was, I think, a big one with collaborative tenders. We found that collaborative tenders, they either need to fall to the lowest common denominator so that everyone can agree on what goes out to maintain simplicity in their management, or they need to become much more increasingly difficult to manage to enable customisation from council to council. So you can't have both. So making informed decisions. So rather than summarise here, I'd just like to, I think a valid point that came out of it was, it seems like our waste services are becoming much more complicated to manage. There's much more options being given to households, whether it be muds, different size bins, different types of bins. And one thing we found that was the collaborative tendering, collaborative procurement was a much more difficult vehicle to enable that more complicated type of waste management that we're trying to introduce. So I'll probably leave it there and
thank you, Scott. Thanks for
open the floor to questions.